To what extent should the government control our lives? To what extent should they tell us exactly what we do and when we do it? This is a key subject because this week the government came out with a new policy which would involve shutting down the ability for people to be able to smoke in public outdoor spaces. In other words, you can't go to the pub and smoke, but you can go to the pub and smoke in the garden outside the pub. But the government think that is wrong and we should stop doing that. The government also, and I'm not talking specifically about the Labour government, I'm talking about the Conservative government as well, because it was Richie Sunak that brought in a law that would, in theory, have ended up with basically banning the sale of all tobacco products in the UK over the course of the next 10 years or so. This was by stopping people buying tobacco products below a certain age, and that you never reached an age where you were able to do that. That law is still, I believe, on the statute books. The government also have come under pressure in the past for considering the implications of unhealthy food on people's diets and the fact that we have a big obesity problem. They're also bringing in a law, this week it is, whereby people are going to have their betting monitored by the government. And if you bet too much money, and too much money might not be very much money, then you're going to have your betting account closed down. Is this just Big Brother taking over everything, or are the government here on the right track for doing us all a big favour in making us all healthier, making us all live longer, and making us all more responsible? John, which side of the equation are you on?
Well, I think it's a question of attaining balance between individual freedoms and rights on the one hand, and the duty that the state has to protect society. I think there are lots of examples, Chris, that we could cite of things which had an almost taken for granted quality about them 50 years ago that today have been very, very tightly regulated. In 1950, for example, 80% of men in the United Kingdom used to smoke, with all the knock-on consequences for public health. Now, that figure has reduced enormously. I think today the figure is about 13% for the overall population in the UK. And one of the reasons for that is that the state has actively intervened, both to provide education about the dangers represented by cigarette smoking, and has also had to intervene very heavily on the health side to help with lung cancer treatment and so on. So I think there's a very good argument that we could extend, for example, to driving. Think about that era when motor cars did not have safety belts. The
Exactly.
level of accidents was extraordinary. So there's a very, very good argument that the state should intervene in these kind of cases. But in the example that you cite, which is about cigarette smoking outside, I was in the UK 10 days ago and I was in a pub with friends in Surrey. We were outdoors, and I have to say the smoke barely bothered me. But against that, we all remember, I think, the era before smoking in pubs and restaurants, and it was horrific for those of us who didn't smoke. We had to suffer all the consequences of absorbing that smoke that people ingested in the landscape. Ireland, incidentally, was the first country in the world to introduce that ban in 2004. And I think there's an interesting contrast here. In both the UK and Ireland, the level of compliance with the rule is incredibly strong. It's over 90% in both jurisdictions. I'm speaking to you today from Bulgaria. They were much, much of a laggard in introducing the same kind of legislation. And the problem is that it's not properly enforced here because the rule of law simply isn't adhered to in the same way that it is in the UK and Ireland. So it doesn't really matter in the summer. Most restaurants are outside, people are dining outside. But once you switch to September, it becomes a real issue because there is widespread defiance of the law on the part of both people who smoke in restaurants here and the owners of these establishments. So I think we've got the balance right in our part of the world. But I have to say, I think this step does go that bit too far. And I think we have to come back to that balance between individual rights and the right of society, to have an environment that is healthy and relatively protected.
Well, it is a fine line, and I remember. I mean, I from the music business, and Nick would remember this as well. Going to gigs in the old days. I mean, the smoke was just absolute. It was just unbelievable. And you would get home, you'd take a sweater off. I mean, you couldn't wear it until it was washed again. It'd be so impregnated with smoke, and actually, you would have a really major nicotine hangover the next morning from all the nicotine that you'd ingested. So, I mean, we're all in favour of that. I'm sure of that. But, sometimes I'm in outdoor spaces. If I'm eating outdoors, I don't want smoke drifting across me. I mean, Natalie, what do you think about this? I mean, are the government on the right track here?
Very much so. And I think in the introduction, you suggested this was about restricting, but actually look at this round the other way. For the majority of people, this is enabling people to breathe fresh air. As John said, there's less than 13% of British people smoke. The vast majority of people don't smoke. Yet if you want to go to a nice pub, say, and it's a glorious day, we can always hope, and you want to sit out there in the pub garden, and that smoke is drifting all around you. Now, that's a question of how pleasant it is, but it's also a very big question in terms of the public health impacts. Passive smoking, people being exposed to smoke that when they're not actually smoking themselves. 80,000 premature deaths is the estimate. And I was just looking at some figures yesterday, a survey from the British Journal of Cancer just out a couple of months ago. Women who've never smoked but who are exposed to passive smoking have a 24% higher risk of breast cancer. Now, we actually have, we know we've got huge problems with air pollution from all kinds of other sources, particularly motor cars. We know we've got all sorts of problems about the pollution in our rivers. We have a polluted society. This is one way of reducing that pollution level. And so that's something that is for the general public good. And I think also, it's worth looking at some of the stats from when that smoking ban came in. And there was I'm concerned about small independent businesses, pubs, keeping pubs open. And there was a lot of concern when the smoking ban came in, the indoor smoking ban in 2007, that this would have a terrible impact. But actually, businesses did as well, if not better than they did before. And figures from back then, 17% of people said they went to pubs more often after the smoking ban. So we're actually talking about a small minority of people when we're talking about smokers.
Yeah, we are. And in fact, apparently, when this policy was announced, there was quite a sizable majority of people in favour of it. I believe I read also last week that California were talking about bringing in a ban on people smoking in their own homes. But Nick, you remember the old days of smoking in clubs when we used to go and see groups play. I mean, how do you think this ban will affect pubs in general?
I don't think you can
with
hear
people
me,
smoking outdoors? Do you think it's another dent in the coffin of the hospitality industry?
Yes, I'll do that. Okay. But I'll keep talking. You used to smoke, if
Yes,
I remember
but not
rightly,
very loud.
very early on, didn't you? Slightly.
Turn your volume up.
Or am I wrong?
Me, I stopped smoking. I was very lucky. I stopped smoking in 1969 or 1970. I was on tour with groups in the States, and in those days you could smoke on aeroplanes, and I was up almost 24 hours a day doing all-night concerts and festivals. And I was walking around New York and my legs were numb from my waist down, and I went to see a doctor. And the doctor, this was before people generally thought that smoking was bad for you. And this doctor in New York told me that I had nicotine poisoning, and if I ever smoked another cigarette, I would die instantly. And he'd rather stop me smoking, and I never smoked another cigarette from that day on.
The thing I don't like is the nanny state, pervading everywhere. But I think in this case, they have to. I think they should stop vaping totally, and they should stop cigarette smoking. I think it's the right thing to do. And if people are stupid enough to continue smoking when there's enough evidence to say they can die from it, it's their problem. But, in public areas, it definitely should be banned, in my view. Well, that drinking isn't proven. I mean, I know people who drink quite a lot who are still very much alive.
Well, I think that's
You know, there
probably right.
isn't
But
the
then
same
how far
medical
do you go? What
evidence
about drinking?
as there is on smoking. But you know, if there was, one would maybe look at it because people, you know, don't seem to worry about. I mean, the other thing about cigarettes, I didn't realise how much they cost now. It's amazing. You know, you to get 10 cigarettes, it's something like I think £17 or something. I saw somebody paying when I was buying a newspaper the other day at Marylebone Station. I couldn't believe what he was handing over. You know, £20 note, a couple of coins in return. But that doesn't seem to work. People who are desperate smokers will pay for it. It shows
Well, I can also.
somebody buy them. You know, doing it himself.
I know when I gave up smoking back in 1969 or nine. You know, when I gave up smoking back in 69 or 1970, it was amazing how much money I had in my pocket that I didn't think I had. And I mean, the people that do smoke, they would be so much better off financially if they don't smoke. But we're not talking about it. We're talking here about the effect of smoking on the National Health Service and the cost of the hospitalisation and treatment for people doing that. But moving on from that, well, it is interesting. I mean, because you could move on to obesity and the obesity problem we've had, and you know when I think it was a previous Labour government that wanted to bring in laws to stop some advertising of foodstuffs that were not healthy, and to discuss the fact that the supermarket checkout points is the least unhealthy food, like all of the high calorie snacks that people pick up. Obesity is a big problem in the UK as well. I mean, to what extent, if we're talking about stopping people smoking as much as we can, should we stop them eating unhealthy food? And John, can people afford to eat healthy food? And Natalie, I mean, is there an issue here where, it's all very well telling people, oh, you've got to eat, vegetables and fruit and pulses and things like that, and not just snack on, stuff that's not good for you, but stuff that's not good for you is often a lot less expensive.
Well, think about this from the point of view of starting your supermarket shop. Think about the amount of sugar that you encounter through aisle after aisle after aisle, and how that sugar is loaded around the tills to make it especially attractive to children, especially, and to tempt people who already have an issue with obesity. And think also about the amount of terrible processed food that you find in our supermarkets and corner shops. It's at a record level, and there is lots of medical evidence now to show that processed food is doing enormous damage. And the latest report that I've seen is that there is a direct link between the amount of processed food and the lack of sleep that many people attest to in their lives. So I think if you look at the public health evidence, Chris, I think the argument for intervention specifically on obesity is as strong as the argument was for the intervention around smoking 20 years ago and 30 years ago. And I don't think governments are invested enough in this, even when you are confronted by the huge costs. And I imagine that nowadays, the cost of treating obesity is actually much more significant than treating people for issues connected to smoking. They are connected, of course, because of cardiovascular damage and things of that kind. But I think governments have been very reluctant to think about, for example, sugar taxes, placing taxes on items that have lots of sugar in them. I would actually argue there's a case for real intervention in terms of the supermarket space, that the amount of sugar and of processed food should be limited to a certain percentage of what's available within the supermarket, to try and counter the kind of saturation levels of this really bad stuff that is blighting huge numbers of lives.
Natalie?
I think John is absolutely right about when he spoke about saturation levels. More than 50% of calories in the British diet come from ultra processed foods. And I think it is worth sort of picking out that term ultra processed, there's something called the NOVA classification, which lots of countries around the world, including Wales, are using to acknowledge these things that are actually food-like substances. And, a general way of identifying ultra-processed food for shorthand is look at the ingredient list on the back. And if it's very long and if it contains things you don't recognise that aren't in your kitchen, then it's ultra-processed foods. And overwhelmingly, when you go round shops, go around supermarkets in the UK, that's what you're confronted with at every side. And that's not people's choice. That's what the supermarkets, the food manufacturing companies have chosen to do to make the maximum profits. So this is not a choice being made by people. It's being a choice being made for maximum corporate profits. And John's absolutely right in saying the problem is that, there were some stats done a few years ago. It's to eat a healthy diet is 3 times as expensive as an unhealthy diet. Mm. And the places where we need to start with government intervention is we should be eating 10 servings of vegetable and fruit a day. The general government advice is 5, but that's only because the sociologists said, well, people are only eating about 2 now. If we tell them to go to 10, it's never going to happen. But the nutritionists will tell you it should be 10. But for us to be able to produce our own fruit and vegetables, which we could do, there's no ecological, biological reason why we couldn't. But that would mean we have to grow 20 times as much vegetables and fruit as we do currently in the UK. So we need to look at land use policy, and there's hopefully going to be a land use framework coming up soon. We need to look at how do we get community gardens? How do we plant fruit trees in parks on streets around so people can just walk along the street and pick an apple? There's so many things that the government can do positively, but what we really have to do is take back control of our food system from the supermarkets, from the multinational companies.
Do you honestly think if there's an apple tree on the street that someone's going to go and pick an apple? I'm not sure actually that the society we live in right now, people are so uninformed about where food comes from. They don't realize that potatoes grow in the ground, and that they probably don't even know that apples grow on trees. They'll think, oh my God, what's that hanging off that tree? They won't know it's an apple. Well, Chris, there's a long way to go to get there.
Yeah, if you haven't been to Todmorden, you really should go and visit Todmorden, because that's the home of Incredible Edible, and that's an organisation which is actually now spread around the world. And all over Todmorden, there are edible plants. So, for example, in the doctor's surgery, every a plant in the car park is an edible plant. And when I was there quite a few years ago now, there was a small raised bed plot of maize in front of the police station, and there was a sign on it that said, "Don't pick this yet; it'll be ready in about 2 weeks." And that's the kind of that's a community group that's got together and changed the whole food environment of Todmorden.
So statistically, are we a more obese country than other European countries?
Very much so, yes. And our consumption of ultra-processed food is higher. And you might recall the horse meat scandal from quite a number of years ago now. One of the figures that came out of that is we eat, on average, twice as many ready meals as the rest of Europe does. But also, when you put that together with it, that our commuting times are twice as long on average as the rest of Europe, and our working hours are the second longest in Europe, that's why we need to think of all of this systemically. So many things push us towards the ultra-processed, the unhealthy food. It's not a question of individuals very often having a choice. They can't afford it. It's a problem of our whole broken food system, and that's clearly something the government needs to intervene in very strongly.
I was speaking to someone recently about the health service in Saudi Arabia, and I think there, when you go and see the doctor and there's something wrong with you, if you're overweight, the doctor says to you, right, here's what you got to do. I'll treat you, but you've got to come back in 2 months' time, and you've got to get your weight down to this level, otherwise I'm not going to treat you. And basically they send them away and they have to go back and do that. Is that a route to go?
Absolutely not, because that's where you're putting the blame on the individual. Whereas, let's imagine you're a single mum, you've got a couple of children to care for, you've got elderly relatives you're caring for as well, you work 3 0-hours contract jobs. And very often the only place where you're able to buy food is the convenience store on the corner, which has no fresh fruit and vegetables. That's not the situation that you're in, is not your fault. We need to change the systems of our society to enable people to be able to eat well, which they're not able to do at the moment.
I have to wonder, Chris, whether there is a role here in the NHS for something like Ozempic. Obviously, it's got a lot of publicity as a weight loss drug over the last couple of years, partly because of celebrity use. But as somebody who himself kind of struggles with his weight, I find as this summer I've lost almost 2 stone, but I inevitably put it back on during the winter when I'm working harder, when there's more stress and I don't have as much time to think about diet and everything else. So I'm actually going to go back to my doctor and ask him about Ozempic. And there does seem to be evidence, not just that it works, but that it also provides other benefits, such as cardiovascular protection at a really significant level. Now, I know some people might argue this is the quick fix route, and I think Natalie is absolutely right about the broken food system and the need to educate people about what they eat and how important that is. But I do wonder if in the near future, whether something like Ozempic and similar drugs are going to help us address this challenge.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that about Ozempic because I've been thinking the very same thing myself over the last few weeks. I lose weight. It's easy losing weight. I do it all the time. The only trouble is it's easy putting it back on because that just happens automatically as well. But I've been reading about Ozempic and it is an interesting drug. Mind you, we're digressing a little bit in talking about that.
Well, and if I can just throw in one sentence, I mean, there is now, as people have been on it for a year or two and come off it, they're finding that if people go off it, they get a rebound to as high a level of previous weight, if not higher. And do you really want to be on what is a drug with significant side effects for life?
Well, does it have it? But if it has major beneficial side effects for life, then maybe you do. Once you go on a statin, you're on a statin for life.
For life. Yeah.
Well, that's something to discuss with your doctor. But I think, to be aware of thinking about that, we've created a really unhealthy society and then we're going to create a medicine so you can continue to live in that unhealthy society. I think we need to confront that situation and think about it.
Well, I think that is the optimum, yeah. Now, what about gambling? I mean, this is another area. The gambling affordability checks come in this week. Anyone that gambles, has a bet on a horse or a football match and loses, is going to have a notification that they've got to go through their bank statements and show their bank statements to make sure that they should be able to place bets. So even if it's only bets for like, 10 or 20 pounds, what, again, conceptually, is that a good idea? I mean, gambling, of course, does create problems. There are people that can't feed the kids because the husband might have a gambling addiction. So in a way, it's the same as smoking and obesity. But is it the right thing for the government to do that?
Well, Chris, may I take a lead on this as somebody who is currently researching gambling, its impact on society and gambling harms? I have to say, I've always loved racing in particular and most sports. I'm a sports fanatic, as I suspect you are too. And I've loved to bet over the years, but we can't ignore the evidence of the harm that gambling is doing, especially in the UK's case since deregulation, which happened under the previous Labour government and was then accelerated. And one of the big differences has been the way in which gambling companies now are able to target young people in particular through social media. And this is the project that we're working on. And I can tell you that if you look at young men between 14 and 24, the figures are absolutely frightening. We've already got a number of NHS gambling clinics in place in the UK. There is even a specialised gambling clinic for young people in London. I think we're going to need more of them in the years to come because the problem is so acute. Now, turning to the affordability issue, I was reading yesterday about Andrew Black, the founder of Betfair, very well known in the betting industry. saying that numerous times over the last few months he couldn't get a bet on himself. Now, I would suggest he constitutes no risk at all. So it does seem ridiculous that people like him are being targeted by this new approach. And I think it is an example of over-regulating, actually. What the gambling companies should be vigilant about, which they have not been, by the way, in the recent past. There have been huge fines issued by the UK Gambling Commission against Paddy Power, against Ladbrokes, Bet365 and other companies, because they just weren't doing what they were obligated to do under the law. But I think there is an issue about how you actually try and scrutinize the ability of any one individual to bet to a specific kind of level, either in a given week or a given month. There are lots of things you have to include, including the risk level that that person represents. In other words, are they engaging in harmful gambling on a regular basis? So if the bookmakers were forced to, I think, really scrutinize the behavior of their customers, that to me would be much more preferable than what I think are actually very small affordability levels that I know have been deeply frustrating for many people who are not harmful gamblers in the least, but whose gambling has been completely compromised or stopped in recent months because of these new rules.
Yeah, quite. Okay, Natalie, but briefly, before we move on, what's your view on that?
Well, I very much agree with John that the gambling industry is utterly out of control and it's a huge threat to communities and individuals in the UK. And this is, like tobacco, a public health problem. I mean, we were thinking about children. There was a study out a couple of months ago. 1.6 million children in the UK live in households where there's a problem gambler. And as you said, Chris, you know, the kids may be going hungry because one of their carers has an addiction. So my focus particularly is on advertising. I mean, I was walking through the one of the tunnels at King's Cross Station, and there was those adverts, very fancy, very highly produced adverts, the whole length of the tunnel about how wonderful football is, and they were actually adverts for gambling.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think this is deeply disporting. You know, we've seen many footballers who've been exposed as having gambling problems, which, you know, is something they're not allowed to do, but they've been gambling anyway. You know, this tie between sport and gambling has done enormous damage. And I'll also just mention the other thing is young people being hooked from a very young age, loot boxes. Which is a form of gambling from within computer gaming, which sets people up. You know, you pay this, and maybe this will take you to the top of the league in this gambling, in this gaming situation, or maybe you won't get anything. It's gambling. We desperately need to stop exposing people to so many dangers, enabling them to have a healthy environment to live in, to grow up in.
Can I just give you, just very briefly, some of our figures, Chris, to demonstrate the point that Natalie's making? We analysed the amount of advertising on broadcast television and as well on social media, and we looked specifically at special events, including, for example, the World Darts Championship. Darts is hugely popular. I love it myself. I watched most of the World Championship last December and January. But in one recording, which was the final between Luke Littler and Luke Humphreys, we recorded 1,159 different gambling adverts. I was watching that championship of the 2 weeks, more or less, and you know what Alexandra Palace is like, the way they whip up the atmosphere. There were numerous instances where I saw children as young as 12 waving slogans with the Paddy Power logo on it. I mean, that is just ridiculous. It just should not be allowed. We found that at Kempton and Chepstow, the Christmas racing festivals, the ITV coverage, 648 different times advertising was featured over a 2.5-hour period. So there is a huge problem there. The University of Bristol last year did a study of the first set of Premiership games in August 2023. 6 games, almost 7,000 gambling ads in those 6 games. some European countries have gone as far as banning sponsorships completely. In Belgium, for example, shirt sponsorships are going to be banned from the 1st of January 2028. Spain has also introduced very significant legislation. What my impression of the UK, by the way, Ireland is about to legislate in October the most comprehensive gambling legislation we've ever had, partly modelled on the UK. But when I look back at the recent review of gambling in the UK, the thing you come away from thinking is the industry lobbying has really worked, and it's far too timid relative to the scale of the problem that Natalie has just outlined.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, the other side of the equation is the extent to which the gambling ads are paying for the sports. And you talk about football. I think in England, and Nick would know this, the Premier League are banning betting companies from advertising, but they don't want to take it away from the Football League in general, because if they did, a lot of teams in the Football League would really suffer financially. I think that's the case, Nick, isn't it?
Sponsor on the shirt. So it's about, I think it's very tricky with any of these rules, because people who, I've tried all these gambling, smoking, whatever. But I'm not an obsessive personality, so I don't sort of, I can give them up. I can stop doing it. If I lose, I hope when I lose a £20 bet on a few matches on Saturday, I won't bet for another 4 weeks. I thought, why did I lose £20? These, you've got to look at the basis behind people who do it regularly. They need treatment. I mean, the poor guys who can't afford to eat because they're gambling, they need medical treatment as well. It's not just because of an obsession with doing it. And I don't know how you deal with that, but I think it should be moved away from sport, which is the place where it's most prevalent. It should be regulated and prohibited in some cases, and it needs to be done quickly, because it's a really bad thing, I think, for people who are obsessive personalities and won't give up doing it. It's terrible.
Well, it clearly is a problem. Another area where the government might need to intervene is in the area of ticketing. Now, this week we've had the tickets go on sale for the Oasis concerts, for the Oasis reunion tour in the summer of 2025, and it appears that the tickets, which were on sale at a certain price of about £150 each, by the time you actually managed to try and get hold of a ticket, the price had gone up by 200 or 300% because of dynamic ticketing. Now, Nick, you're an expert in the ticketing area. Can you just fill us in on exactly what the situation is with how these ticketing companies do operate, and why people are being asked to pay a great deal more for the ticket than they thought they were going to be paying when they first went on the site to get their ticket?
Ticketing systems, ticket touting, dynamic pricing, etc. But let's deal with dynamic pricing. First of all, dynamic pricing has been around airlines, hotels, and so on for a long time. So if you're going to ban it in ticketing, are you going to ban it in other areas? When Manchester United get a drawn away at Milan in a European game, the ticket price of the plane will suddenly rise unbelievably. That's got nothing to do with the ticket. So it's around dynamic pricing. One thing I can tell you is that Ticketmaster in the press I read got blamed for the dynamic pricing. The dynamic pricing would only have been switched on at the request of the promoter and the management. Ticketmaster or any ticket company never has any control over the pricing of a ticket for the show. That is decided solely by the management of the act, their agent, and their promoter. And you get told what the ticket price is. And if you've got a system that enables dynamic pricing, you don't switch it on unless you're requested to do so by the promoter. So, and they must have done that. You cannot, the main part of, you've got two prices. You've got the face value of the ticket, you've got the booking fee. Now, who benefits from the booking fee? The ticket agent, probably sharing some of that income with the promoter and the artist. Who benefits from the face value of the ticket? The promoter and the act only, not the ticket company. Apart from, is the price has gone up, they're earning increased commission. But the main beneficiary of the face value of the ticket is the artist. They're the ones who probably, allowed Ticketmaster, requested Ticketmaster to do that. Now, whether it's wrong or right, it does, as I said, it happens everywhere. It happens. All that, there's a hotel in Manchester that cancelled all the bookings it had around the Oasis dates and told people they couldn't stay, and then put the price up by £200, £300 a night. It's not just ticketing. How does the government do with that? God only knows, because everybody profiteers off it. The restaurants in the city might put their prices up when people are there. It's not just about ticketing, and it's a very difficult area, in my view, to control. Second thing is, and also, is the artist. There's also another thing, with you take the artist, if they set their ticket price at £150, in my view, they should keep it there. It's whether Oasis or their management or the promoter authorize this or not, I think it's a bad decision. Because I think somebody's queued for 5 hours and they're thinking they're going to buy a ticket or 2 tickets for £150 each, and they're suddenly told it's £350. They're going to be very upset. And they're fans of the band. And there's an emotional attachment between a fan and the artist. It's different from, you don't have an emotional attachment with airlines or with hotels, probably. You have an emotional attachment with a fan, you have an emotional attachment with a football club. So if people mess around with those prices, they're messing around with something bigger than just the price. They're messing around with the fans' emotions and their ties to the, to the artist or to the football club or whatever. So I think you have to consider that. But equally, the artists will see tickets being touted at £1,000. They're thinking, well, why is a ticket tout getting, a markup of £800 and we're not, right? And why should they? They contribute nothing. They probably bought the ticket through a bot. They got a lot of them. Or there's a recent case where a woman was prosecuted in Suffolk who was called the Ticket Queen. I mean, she had 400 different credit cards she was using to book tickets. Now, if you have 400, you book 4 tickets, you're getting 1,600 tickets, and you mark them up, £100 each, you're making £160,000 on a one show. It's a lot of money. Is that right? Anyway, it's a lot of money. So there's all these concerns. The artists think, well, maybe I should have a piece of that. And some artists, do reserve tickets, take tickets out of the inventory that they will give to a company like Viagogo or StubHub to sell, so they can participate in the increased price. It's their work, it's their show. Is that immoral? I don't know. So there's many considerations here. And also touting. I'm going through this quickly. There's only one way to stop touting, and Glastonbury Festival do it. Glastonbury Festival insists that your photograph is put on the ticket. So during the whole year, you can download, even whether you've got a ticket or not, you can go onto the Glastonbury site, you can download your picture. If you're fortunate enough to get a ticket, because they put the tickets on sale in October and the show's on to June, they have time to then print a proper ticket out with a picture on. And you'll never see now a Glastonbury ticket being touted. It's amazing. It stopped it completely. And you go through all the tout websites, and that's because Michael Eavis, the promoter there, was determined. He was more upset by ticket touting than anybody I know, and he was determined to stop it. And you could have done it with Oasis because they've got time. You could have done pictures, but then the venues have got to agree to it as well, and extra work of checking it and so on. So there's a lot, but that you could do. Photographs on tickets at Glastonbury have stopped ticket touting, right? And so you could do that. You couldn't do that, for every show taking place in England. I mean, you've got to have a lead time and so on. But that's one way of doing it for big shows. The other thing I think
do we have any idea of the people going on the sites to buy tickets, the percentage of them that are normal people like you and I trying to buy a ticket, and the percentage which are robots specifically trying to buy tickets to resell on the black market?
Anybody want tickets? I think only 5-6% of the ticket face got onto the black market. I think now, because online and bots and everything else, maybe 20-30% get on the black market. So maybe they're resold. Some tickets resold 2 or 3 times. The other thing is the bulk of the people the whole thing about resale.
So you think maybe 25-30% of bots?
Started it, which was for Viagogo for one. They justify it by saying, if you can't, if it gives somebody a facility to sell tickets when they can't go because their mum died, or whatever it might be. And that I understand, but that's about 2%. If you look at those sites, the ticket touts now use those sites to resell tickets. And, they should be looked at by the government, like Viagogo, and definitely on resale, they could put a limit. The problem is, a lot of these sites are cited outside the UK. How do you legislate them? And also, the artists say they'll check tickets when you go in and you print out. They manage to do that in some cases, but that happens also very rarely. So it's a complete mess, that side of things. And unless there are strong laws in certain Australia, Germany, there are places that are trying to stop it, but it needs a really amount of thought and work. But the government shouldn't just sit back and do it. They should consult with people who know what they're doing and talk through it and how best you can reduce it, not cut it out maybe, but let's just reduce it, because that would help. And I think another thing that Oasis, this is in hindsight, could have done, they could have put less shows on sale and they sell them in, so they might start to say only selling two concerts, 3 concerts. You're allowed 4 tickets per person, that's fine. You then analyse those first 2 shows and you take out all the people who have managed to get through and buy more than 4 tickets, cancel their tickets. You then say, and you also have to say, if you've already bought tickets for this show, you are not allowed to buy for any other shows. So then you put the next 2 days on sale. You do the same exercise, you go through, you see who have bought tickets, and you match them against who bought for the first 2 shows and see if they've doubled up. You then throw them out, right? And so on. You do it, and they've got time for a show like this, which is not till next summer. You've got time to do that. And you end up, and Taylor Swift did that. She didn't put her tickets on sale all at once, and they could do that and check the shows. They, it's easier to check the shows and stop people booking twice and so on if you do it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Let me bring Roberta in here briefly, because Roberta is a member of the general public who tried to buy tickets for Oasis. Roberta, what was your experience of this whole process?
Well, it was just really frustrating. I went on at about, number one, I'm not a massive Oasis fan, but I would like to go and see them. And I went on at about 8:30 on Saturday morning. I think I was 480,000th in the queue. So I was in the lobby, and then I was kind of definitely maybe absolutely no chance here. But I kind of figured out, I'm just going to hold it and see and hold my place and see what happens. It was really slow to go down. 7.5 hours later, it suddenly quickened up. And I thought, oh my goodness, here's my chance to buy a £500 ticket. And it kind of clicked onto the next stage of it, and it said, "We think you're a bot." And my husband was doing it kind of in tandem with me. And I said to him, "They think I'm a bot." And he went, "They think I'm a bot." And I was like, oh my goodness, it was so frustrating.
And then what happened when they thought you were a bot?
I just, then I kind of I hit refresh a couple of times because it just got stuck and it said, "We think you're a bot." And so then I then got sent back. I then got back to be offered to join the queue all over again, at which point I was like, you know what?
You said you were 480,000 in
the
queue. That almost answers
I didn't, to be honest, I didn't hold much hope that I'd get a ticket.
Ticketmaster have had problems before. They had problems with Taylor Swift recently, and that's caused such an uproar in America that they're now getting investigated by Congress, and they're having to appear in court now. Because they're looking at the monopoly position of Live Nation and Ticketmaster. And that's happening in America, not here. And there is a problem, I think, with that. But we'll see how that pans out. And they had problems in the UK with the Olympics. When they first went on sale, they had to suspend sales because demand was so great, they couldn't handle it, and they had to redo the system, put them on sale again about 3 weeks later. But generally, ticket companies are quite well set up. You do get the Oasis was an exception. You're not going to get another Oasis probably unless Taylor Swift works again, for another 3 or 4 years. And the systems are very strong. The company I last worked for, Eventim, who are a German company, they've never had problems. They've just handled the Paris Olympics. They sold 9 million tickets for it, and that's gone very, very well. But you have to have very, very resilient equipment, huge hardware, and so on. And it's not worth, as a business, investing in something if it only happens every 5 years. And people did get through. I talked to the head of Ticket when I knew I was going to do this. I talked to the CEO at Ticketmaster, and he said the website didn't go down, but there were obviously some problems with the queuing system, and people. No.
I think there were a lot of and I'm not the only person. I've spoken to many people over the last few days, and a lot of people had the same issue. It's just annoying and boring.
Yeah,
I've got to be honest.
I don't know how that happened. I mean, they must
I
have
wasn't
something in their queuing
surprised because
system,
I thought it would.
right,
I didn't
which
think I'd
shows
get a
them,
ticket,
which
but I was
technically
surprised that I was
says
a bot.
This person could be a bot. So what it is, how it
Well,
works, I haven't got a clue, right? But there must be something there. Yeah, might be. But the thing
would
is,
it be that because she stayed on the
in
line so
reverse of
long,
that, you
would
should be
only a
pleased
bot
that
stay
they're
on the
trying to
line
identify
7
bots.
hours?
What are you trying to say, Chris?
That's not the way to look at it.
Okay, yeah, well, that's true. Anyway, Nick, thanks for your insight there. It's very useful. I mean, perhaps Natalie and John, the government don't need to get involved here. Perhaps the industry is attempting to police itself, and perhaps
I'm
this was a bit of a one-off, and we shouldn't all get too concerned that the DCMS are going to get involved in it.
I think one of the underlying issues is that how much genuine competition is in there in the ticketing market. If we're relying on the market to control these things, what happens if one company is the big dominant company that, if you're big, you have to go to, if you're a big artist, you have to go to. And I think there's some work being done in America on that. And so many elements of our economy are actually being dominated by a handful or even just one company. And that's something that what the Americans call trust issues, we call competition issues. I think right across our economy, there's some big issues around lack of competition that's supposed to be the thing that keeps companies in check. Is just
not they're looking at it. Tessa Chow was the nearest who came to doing something, but they haven't. It's going to be a very difficult. They need to tread slowly and do this thoroughly and really look at all the issues because they're more complex than people think. The other thing about selling through one company, it can be better because if you've got one company selling quicker than another and runs out of tickets, right, and you think, oh, well, they've all gone, I won't bother, but another company's holding tickets, if you're all in one place, you know what's happening with every ticket. So it's an argument to put the tickets through one. I'm not saying it should always happen. Probably with Oasis, it's probably better to spread it around because there were two companies doing them, C Tickets and Ticketmaster. But it's another thing to look at. Is it better to have them all in one place? Do you know exactly what's happening to every ticket?
Yeah.
Well,
John?
I have to say that while all of this was happening online, I was watching friends of mine, just like Roberta, in the queue at 50,000, 100,000, 500,000. And I couldn't really understand this, that they were queuing to buy tickets for a completely incoherent, barely literate purveyors of bad elevator music. I mean, I just don't get it. I just don't understand it.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a different subject.
He's a secret Swiftie, aren't you, John?
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay, John, and finally, and Natalie, across the pond. The last time you were on the podcast, John, was when Kamala Harris had just been announced that she was becoming the Democratic candidate for in the presidential election. And you said, despite the fact what the bookies, and we've talked about bookies, and what the pollsters were saying, you said Kamala Harris was going to win. How is it going? Is she still going to win? Or there's a lot to play for still, isn't there?
Yeah, for sure. I think she is going to win, Chris. I don't think she's put a foot wrong since she's been nominated. I think she made a fantastic choice in Tim Walz as her running partner. I think he's been a phenomenal success in part because he doesn't speak like an elite Democrat. He speaks like the teacher that he was for most of his career. And I think that's really getting through to people, particularly in the Midwest where he's from, but I think on a much wider basis as well. We know that since Harris and Walsh were announced, the numbers have changed radically. To the extent that the opinion polls can tell us anything accurately and scientifically, we see now that Harris holds a nationwide lead, somewhere between 2 and 5 percentage points. It will need to be, by the way, because the Electoral College is weighted against the Democrats. And remember, the Republicans have only won the popular vote once this century. That was George W. Bush in his second election in 2004. So it's commonly expected Harris is going to win by at least the margin that Biden won by in the popular vote. We all know, however, that this is an election about a range of 7 or 8 different states. And the interesting thing to me is that states that 3 or 4 months ago Biden was behind by 8 or 10 percentage points are now within the margin of error, or they're seriously in play. States like North Carolina, for example, the Democrats had no expectation that they'd be level there or have any chance. And I think one of the most crucial things that has produced the momentum, two things actually. First, the Democratic campaign, especially online, has been fantastically professional. They're getting through using Instagram and TikTok to young people at an unprecedented level. And secondly, if you look at the registrations of women in particular, they have gone up enormously after the announcement of Harris as the candidate. And I think women are going to decide this election, not just because Kamala Harris is a woman, prospectively the first woman of color to become president, but because women have been so traduced by the other side. The utter misogyny and creepiness of Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, who is a complete liability, in my view, relative to his opponent, his opposite number, Tim Walz. I think that's a real issue. And we know, Chris, that every time, for example, abortion has been on the ballot since the reversal of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court, the Democrats have won. Why? Because even Republican women, when they think about their own family members, think that they might need an abortion sometime in the future. At absurd levels, some Republicans are arguing for the banning of IVF. Trump has just no idea how to deal with this, and he's been all over the place on both abortion rights and IVF. So I think if that continues to be a big, big issue in the campaign, and I think it will, I think women are going to turn out in record numbers on the 5th of November, and they are going to consign Trump and Vance to history.
Isn't Trump changing his stance a bit, Natalie, on women's reproductive rights in general? And I mean, does he risk alienating his own base if he does that in order to defend his position against what John's saying is an important issue in favour of Harris and Walz?
Well, I think assuming that Trump has any kind of fixed position on anything at all would be a false assumption. But I think that there's a few things that are really worth reflecting on, particularly bouncing off what John said. One of the things, first of all, is the extreme dysfunction of the American Constitution. I often say, in terms of the context of the UK, democracy, it would be a good idea. We've got an archaic, dysfunctional constitution. America in the same situation, and I'm amazed that we don't hear more discussion coming out of America about how, because they clearly cannot continue with the mess that they've got now. And I think, whilst I hope that John is right about Harris going to win, we still can't guarantee it. It's on a knife-edge situation because the popular vote really doesn't matter very much in the overall scheme of things. It's it's the state-by-state count that matters. And I think, sitting here in the UK thinking about this, we have to, the rest of the world has to prepare in case that Trump does win, an extremely erratic, frightening Trump in control of America's nuclear weapons, in control of America's immense military forces. I also think the rest of the world has a right to be concerned about what's going to happen if Harris does win, and there's a significant force in American society that doesn't accept the result. And we, of course, have already seen this once.
Yeah.
And there's been a
Yeah.
great deal of preparation. There's been a great deal of planning from the Trump side to claim that the election was stolen again. And where that's going to end up, I don't know. But I think, the dysfunction, America is a failed system, and that's something that the rest of the world has to be concerned about.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of issues here. I mean, firstly, you could say, why do we have the Electoral College? Let's just make it popular vote. But that does favour the Republicans because it gives more weight to the smaller states with the lower populations that get pro rata slightly more Electoral College votes than the big states. So I can't see the Republicans voting to change that anytime soon. So we're probably stuck with that. So it's difficult now. Also, in terms of Trump and the legality of the election, the fact that the last election is stolen, he keeps pumping this out, and people take it on board, especially the evangelical Christians who actually do feel that God is on their side and on the side of Donald Trump, and whatever they do to overturn the result, if it's not the right result, they will be doing God's will. Even, I mean, it's a strange concept, but that's where we're at.
Yes, it is. But one of the interesting things, Chris, compared to 2020 and 2016, is that if you look at the breakdown of polling, when you do the micro level analysis of, say, of evangelicals, there are significantly fewer of them now saying that they will vote for Trump in the way that they definitely said they would at the same interval in 2020. We've also seen an unprecedented number of leading Republicans come out against Trump. 20 out of the 22 cabinet ministers that served with him last time have said they will not vote for him. Mike Pence, within recent days, his vice president, who his supporters tried to hang on the 6th of January, he has said that he'll be voting for Kamala Harris. John McCain's son, within the last few days, has said the same. So I think there's an interesting change there, and it's indicative of the lack of unity in the Trump side. And when we last spoke about this, remember, we had the assassination attempt, and that seemed to solidify support for Trump in the Republican camp. And it was going to make it difficult for his opponents in the Republican camp to come out. But they have done so in recent weeks. And currently, the Republican Party looks much more dysfunctional than the Democratic Party does. Even, I think, the most optimistic Democrats, when it was clear that Biden was going to resign, you remember there was talk about a contested convention in Chicago and so on. That didn't happen. They were incredibly unified. And that is, I think, not just continued, but it's got real momentum behind it now. Two things I would flag, however, as caveats against myself and my own argument. First, the media. I see worrying signs that this campaign looks very similar to 2016, when the Democrats also fielded a woman candidate. Trump is going on with his deranged nonsense day after day. But if there's the slightest sort of question mark that is raised, for example, more recently about Tim Walz's military service, the New York Times leads with it, CNN leads with it, as if it were a real issue. And in the process, they end up both sidesing this campaign, and that can only benefit Trump, in my view, as we move closer to the 5th of November. But the other issue, and I think this is more important, is again in relation to polling of Trump in particular. We know from 2016 and 2020 that polls underreport the scale of support for Trump. There are different reasons for this. In some cases, people who are polled don't want to admit that they're voting for him. Sometimes it's about the methodology used. But we know that in those two elections, he actually finished up with a much stronger level of support, including popular support in 2020, than the polls had anticipated or he anticipated. For example, at this stage in 2020, Biden was 5 points clear in the national poll of Trump. As of this week, Harris is only 3 points clear within the margin of error. So no matter what I've said, that I think the momentum is clearly behind Harris, and I think she is going to win. And I think it could even be a very big surprise with the Democrats winning back control of the House of Representatives and holding on to the Senate. For all of that, we should be careful about the level of express support in polls for Trump, because it is definitely understated. And the big question is about which side is going to be able to turn out the vote in sufficient numbers. My sense is that the momentum behind Harris is so significant that the Democrats are going to manage it more successfully. But will they do it in the swing states where it really matters?
Yeah. And of course, there's a long way to go, and we've still got September 10 and the debate, and that could be a game changer, Natalie, couldn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's going to be an absolute total mess, to be honest. But I think, reflecting back on what John just said about the polling, British in the British context, in previous elections, the pollsters here have had big problems with shy Tories who wouldn't say they were going to vote Tory. But it's interesting that wasn't really the case. I mean, Labor didn't get the figures that were expected in the most recent election here, but it wasn't because people turned out for the Tories. The shy Tories previously hadn't been prepared to tell the Tories pollsters they were going to vote for the Tories. This time we got to a situation, and I was actually just in Diss, in the Waveney Valley constituency, which the Green Party took off the Tories this year. And, I was knocking on doors and finding so many people who were saying, I voted Tory all my life, I'm not going to do it now. Will there be, a kind of respectable Republican parallel to a respectable Tory here in the UK who just says, Trump is so far off the wall, and indeed J.D. Vance? And I think we shouldn't underestimate. I mean, I've been reading, some of the philosophers and the political thinkers that have inspired him, and it's terrifying, and it is very, very gendered. Speaking as a woman, some of the things that he said is, literally going back to Victorian kind of models of how gender should be arranged in society. It's quite breathtaking. So whether that will be enough to mean that the people who wouldn't tell pollsters they were going to vote for Trump before are now actually going to say, well, no, I'm actually really not going to. And the answer is we don't know. And I think one of the other things to be really careful about is, it was very frustrating if we think back to our general election campaign we've just had here. Day after day after day, the headlines were all about what do today's polls say. And that's not giving, that I have to say this as a former newspaper editor. I used to be editor of The Guardian Weekly, the international edition of The Guardian. The media is really failing people in the UK, and even more so perhaps in the US, by actually failing to address the issues, failing to give people the chance to engage in the debate, think about, if you're concerned about education. We had no coverage of education in the recent UK election campaign. If you're concerned about health, coverage about the NHS, but none of all the public health issues that we were debating in the first part of this program. So there is a real problem with media reporting politics like it's a football game. Actually, it's about the future, the structure, the way our society is arranged, and we need media to discuss those things, not to just report today's polls.
Yeah, maybe we're too obsessed with polling then, too obsessed with looking at it like
I have to say, Chris,
like a horse race or a football match. Who's winning?
I look at my YouTube algorithms, and because I'm very interested in American politics, every day I will get segments from CNN, MSNBC, and I would say 3/4 of them are about the latest polling. There's just this obsession with it. And remember, those polls were significantly wrong in 2016. They were wrong again in 2022, the midterm elections, where the Democrats did much better than the polls suggested. But Natalie is right. There is this obsession. It is a beauty contest in the United States. And actually, the sad thing is, I think the Biden administration has a very good story to tell about putting in place a muscular industrial policy with green energy at the end, at the core of it, things like reducing prescription drug charges for diabetes and so on. And all of that just gets drowned out by all the other stuff.
Yeah, it's just come down to personalities, and well, I suppose that's the world we're living in. Anyway, thank you all very much. I think we've nailed it. Great conversation. You've been listening to Right on the Nail with me, Chris Wright. Thank you to Natalie Bennett, Nick Blackburn, and John O'Brennan for joining me. And it's it's really great that you were able to do that. If you enjoyed the episode and previous episodes, please share it with your friends and family, and make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app. The podcast is produced by soundsapient.com. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time on Right on the Nail, when we'll have a lot more interesting things to talk about.